multiple main islands in Galapagos. And so here's the core part of the Galapagos, and each of these islands are separated by anywhere from, let's say, 10 to 15 kilometers of water. And so there's limited movement between them, and the habitats are different on them. So just looking at this picture here, you can see that there's lush greenery in some of the islands here, Santiago, Santa Cruz, and Isabela. But if you go over to the black right here, you see Española, which is very dry. Genovesa up at the top here is also very dry. So this is what drove the diversification of a given species into different forms on the different islands, such as those saddle-backed and domed tortoises that I was talking about previously. Okay, so that means that you can get this one thing that comes from the mainland, lands on the islands, colonizes all the different islands, and then specializes on each of the different islands, and therefore generates a bunch of different traits that best suit them for those different environments. Now, another really important feature is that there's a lot of environmental variation in Galapagos, driven in part by the degree of upwelling that occurs along the islands. So the trade winds generally blow off the coast of Ecuador from east to west, and as a result, they blow warm water off of the mainland and off of the Galapagos Islands, which leads to cold water upwelling from below. And that leads to a lot of productivity along the coast that has a dramatic effect on all of the land organisms and the marine organisms. But that varies dramatically between seasons and from year to year, which is what is driving rapid evolution of organisms on Galapagos. So here's an example of the seasonality in the Galapagos. It's right on the equator now. So the amount of sunlight it gets is 100% the same through the entire year. And yet, because of other patterns of ocean circulation, you have very distinct wet and dry seasons. But more to the point, sometimes you don't even have a wet season. So you always have dry seasons, but sometimes you don't have a wet season. So here, for example, is the variation in the amount of rainfall across years in the wet season. So the blue periods on the upper figure there. There's a summation of that amount of rain there for each of the years, for those months. So some years you have tons of rain, and other years you have very little rain. Now, as a result of this seasonality, as well as variation from year to year in the amount of rain in a given season, you have this incredible effect on variation in the terrestrial environment and the marine environment, but I'm focusing on the terrestrial environment. So here's a dry season here, and you can see that there's almost no greenery anywhere. So the plants basically drop all their leaves, they don't reproduce, they die back if they're not annuals. Sorry, if they are annuals. And then the rains come, and 2 weeks later, that exact same location looks like this. So rains have started on the left, and 2 weeks later, it looks like it is on the right. So massive shifts in climate that then generate massive shifts in the environment, which should then generate massive shifts in the organisms that are adapting to those environments. And the organisms I want to talk about, of course, are the Darwin's finches. So Darwin's finches are a radiation of a group of, let's say, 14 species, but people argue about how many species there actually are. And the key aspect of the radiation is that they each show beak sizes and shapes that suit them best for use of a different resource. So you have large beaked birds over here that crack large seeds, and then you have smaller beaked birds that are cracking smaller seeds. Meanwhile, you have birds that have almost a parrot-like beak that are vegetarian. You have birds that have more warbler-like beak that are used for eating insects. And then you have birds that are also specialized in almost like a woodpecker lifestyle. So this radiation has been driven by the diversity of resources in Galapagos as a result of natural selection. Here's what the birds look like in the real world. These are pictures I've taken over the years where you have across the top here 3 different beak sizes of seed-eating ground finches. Another ground finch here that feeds on cactuses, And all of these four are very closely related, to the point that some people don't think they should be called separate species. But if you look at them, you can see they're dramatically different in beak size and shape. This is a woodpecker finch on the lower left, which is also famous as a tool user. This is a vegetarian finch. You can see its really large body that has a long gut that's important for digesting plant matter. And here's one of the insect eaters over here. Okay, so what I want to do with this radiation now is sort of merge some of the basic ecological evolutionary concepts that Gita was talking about with this sort of historical narrative that I gave you in that introductory video, and talk about four different types of insight that these birds are giving us about the way evolution works. So first I want to talk about that classic work of Peter and Rosemary Grant studying the rapid evolution of finches in the Galapagos, which was one of the best examples for many years of the fact that natural selection drove rapid evolutionary change. Then I want to talk about a little bit about our work on how that evolution within species generates the diversity of species by looking at a part of this radiation that is still ongoing. That is, one species is in the midst of becoming two. Then I want to give a brief mention as to how the evolutionary processes in Galapagos that drove the radiation of Darwin's finches is kind of being reversed, or at the very least changed dramatically by the influences of humans. And finally, I want to point out that it's not just the finches that are evolving, it's everything in Galapagos, including the things that the finches are interacting with. So in particular, the seeds that the finches are eating, those plants are also evolving their defenses in response to these finches. Okay, so let's start with just a brief summary that recapitulates what I talked about in that introductory video with some of the classic work on rapid evolution by Peter and Rosemary Grant. So I mentioned this small island of Daphne Major in the Galapagos Islands that Peter and Rosemary worked on, and here's a picture of it here that I'm taking a picture from our study site on a larger island. And in 1977, which was fairly early on when they were working there, they had a very bad drought, which meant that there was almost no reproduction of the plants on that little island. Now, finches require the production of plants to generate the seeds and anything else that they might feed on. And so when there's a drought, there's almost nothing to eat. So you can see here that occurs during that drought period. So if you go out and you measure the seeds that are in the soil, this is my student doing it on the left here, but the same would be true for Peter and Rosemary and their folks. And this shows what happens over here to seed abundance and how hard the seeds are during that drought period. So the first thing is that the abundance of seeds decreases dramatically in the seed bank on the ground. So here, so that means that there's less and less for the finches to eat. Also, during this period, the finches first deplete all the smaller and softer seeds because they're easy to eat. And as a result, the average size and hardness of the remaining seeds goes up, which means not only is there less food for the finches, but it's harder for them to eat it. So during this period, because of these limited resources, you saw a massive decline in the number of birds that were present. So during that drought, 90% of all the finches died. There was no reproduction of the finches that was occurring, just mortality of the adults. So the question is, who was living and who was dying? Was there something about their traits that allowed some individuals to live and others not to live? So the way we study these things, and the way Peter and Rosemary did and many others, is sort of just a classical approach to ornithology, where you catch a bunch of birds in mist nets that you hang out in the morning. Then you remove them from the nets, you measure a bunch of things about them. And with Darwin's finches, that the primary interest is in the size and shape of the beak. So you use calipers and measure the beaks. Then you put bands on the bird so that you can identify them later as individuals. And then you spend the next, 2 decades walking around, finding out who's living and who's dying based on the birds you've measured every single year. Also, more recently, blood samples are taken for genomic analysis. Okay, so this is going to summarize what you saw earlier. This is really the best example of rapid evolution in nature for quite some time. So it's important from a historical context where Darwin's finches were important in making people realize that evolution wasn't just something that required millions of years, but was something that could take place over just a few years. So on the top, you have a frequency histogram, so the number of birds in relation to the size of their beak. So birds over here have large beaks, birds over here have small beaks. This is the distribution before the drought occurred. Then this is the distribution of the surviving birds that made it through the drought. Now there's many fewer birds here. You can see the difference in scale on this axis here. But what's interesting is that the average of the population has shifted. So that means that the average beak size of the birds that lived was larger than the average beak size of the birds that were present before that drought. So you've done something to the current generation. That is, you've weeded out more of the small birds and left the large birds, because those are the ones that can eat the large and hard seeds that are left in the seed bank. Now, as Gita pointed out, you would like to know, is this change that has happened in the adults, that is, you've got an larger average beaks left after the period of the drought, will that be transferred to offspring? And so using these sort of relationships between parents and offspring, you see that the size of the beaks of the parents is a very good predictor of the size of the beaks of the kids. So that means that if something happens to the distribution of parents, that is, the ones with small beaks die, then it's going to be the large beak birds that are reproducing, and they will pass on the genes for large beaks to their offspring. So you would expect the next generation to have larger beaks. I'll return later to show you that, and I mentioned earlier, that we do know some of the genes involved in this process. So now you're looking at not the selection anymore, that is the adults before and after the drought, but you're looking at the average size of finches that were hatched before the drought versus the average size of finches, their beak size after the drought. And again, you see that there has been a shift in the average value of the beak size. So beaks have gotten bigger because parents that had the larger beaks were the ones who survived, and they passed on the genes that coded for larger beaks to their offspring. So evolution happened. Now, the benefit of this system is that looking at the size and the shape of the beaks over many years, you can look at sort of a longer term trajectory to evolution. And so over here, you see beak size on this axis here through time, and that red line there is the evolutionary period I just talked to you about. Then you see a period of stability after that. Then beak size declines again as conditions change, another period of stability. And then we, after this time series, entered into another period of rapid change. So by tracking the traits that are highly heritable through time, you can show that evolution is proceeding rapidly sometimes, it's going up and down, and it's basically matching organisms for their local environments, almost in real time. So, classic work on rapid evolution. Now, that's fine, but that's only a single species in a single location. How did you end up with these 14 different species via that process? Now, it's hard to know how different species came to be. That is, how did irradiation occur? Because it happened a long time ago. It's not something you can observe in real time. So we just watched evolution of one of these things occurring in real time. Peter and Rosemary did. But how can we watch this process of one species becoming two? Well, it turns out that in Galapagos, there are some situations where you can actually do that. And that's what we've been trying to do. So the next part of this work is continue talking about these ground finches that Peter and Rosemary were working on, but to ask not just about one species, but about these 4 species here. So you have small beak ground finch over here that eats small seeds. You have the large ground finch over here that eats large seeds. You have the cactus specialist finch. And then within the medium ground finch, the one that's intermediate in beak size between the small and the large, you have two morphs. That is, you have a small beaked version of the medium ground finch, and you have a large beaked version of the medium ground finch, which suggests that that species is in the midst of taking one distribution and becoming two, which will then potentially make two new species. So we leveraged this variation in these two morphs to understand that process. So let's go to one place in Galapagos and take a look at the finch community. So that's El Garapatero, which is on the central island of Santa Cruz. It's found right here. The main town is in gray over here. This is what El Garapatero looks like on the right in a reasonably wet year, and those are a couple of my colleagues. So go to this location, El Garapatero, catch all the birds, and look at the distribution of beak size across the three seed-eating finches, so the small, medium, and large. This is what the distribution looks like. So this is the number of birds on the axis here, and this is their beak size on the x-axis on the bottom. Now, you can see that you have each of the three species present. So you have the small ground finch here, you have the medium ground finch in the middle, and there's a few birds of the large ground finch over here. But what's interesting is that the medium ground finch doesn't just show this one average beak size, but it really kind of shows two different modes, if you will. That is, there's a bunch of small fortis here. That's the medium ground finch, is Geospiza fortis. And there's a bunch of large ones over here. So it's not like a single unimodal distribution that declines to nothing. Instead, you have this bump up of large birds over here. So that suggests that this one species is kind of caught in the middle of this process where one species becomes two. And we can dial in on that species and try and understand what are the evolutionary forces that are causing one species to become two. This is the two morphs here within the one species, small fortis over here and large over here. So it's a big difference in the beak size. This is not a trivial variation within a species. Okay, so the basic idea for the finches is that feeding on different things causes you to evolve different beaks. And so we suspect then that the large beaked medium ground finch should feed on something different than the small beaked medium ground finch. And this is showing that that is the case. So these two axes here are just sort of multivariate combinations of diet, that is, different plant types. It's not just one plant type on each axis, it's just sort of a combination of multiple ones. And then the y-axis is the average beak size of birds feeding on that part of the plant community. And what you see is that the large beak ground finches here are specializing on a particular part of the diet and plant and seed community. In particular, the large ground finches are feeding on large seeds, which is what we expect. So that means that within this one species, you have the small ones feeding on one type of resource and the large ones feeding on another, which is presumably why they have different beak sizes. Now, if that's the case, the birds that are in the middle, so you have large ones doing well on one resource, small ones doing well on the other resource, but in the middle, maybe there's no resource for them and they'll do poorly. So we can look at survival through time of birds with different beak sizes. So on this axis, you have the size of the beak for the birds within this one species. Again, this is all the Geospiza fortis, the medium ground finch. And this is the expected survival of beaks with different birds. Birds with different beaks, beak sizes. And so you see that the small ones are doing pretty well. They have a reasonably high survival. The large ones are doing pretty well. But the ones in between are not doing well. So this is called disruptive selection. That is, natural selection isn't pushing it in one direction. Instead, it's taking one distribution and pulling it apart, which is how speciation should take place. Now, that would be destroyed if they all just mated together with each other. If the small birds mated with the big ones, it would just mix the distribution all up again. But beak size influences who you mate with as well, because it influences the songs of the birds. And so we also looked at who was mating with who. And sure enough, within this one species again, small females, these are pairs of birds. All these dots are individual pairs of birds that were mating and producing offspring. And you can see that small females mate with small males, and large females tend to mate with large males. So not only is natural selection pushing them apart, but it makes them not mate with each other anymore. Importantly, there are a few cross-type matings, which is what generates the intermediate birds, which are then natural selection continues to act against. So it's in the middle. They're not separate species. They're not one species. They're kind of in the middle somewhere. And as a result, I won't go into detail on this, but there's some small average genetic differences between these two types within this one species. That is, they're in the middle, in the early stages / middle of becoming new species. So we've subsequently done a whole bunch more work showing that, yes, selection really is always pushing these two types apart within this one species. And so the gray, this is different years, and the gray is the distribution of beak size, and this blue and black curves show that intermediate birds between these two sizes on the top here, the ones in the middle don't do very well when it comes to survival. So selection is always pushing them apart. And that's how you take a single species that might be undergoing rapid evolution and generate two species by having selection push one way for part of the distribution and the other way for the other part of the distribution. And we're doing this kind of analysis for the entire community as well. Now, we've discussed how beak size is heritable. That is, large parents give birth to large kids, and that's how evolution works. But nowadays, we'd also like to know what specific genes are involved in that. So we've done a large amount of genomic work identifying particular genes that are driving this evolution and are underlying beak size. And so just like we would expect, there's a bunch of genes involved in beak size, including some large candidate genes, large effect genes. This one is called HMGA2. By the way, what you're looking at here is this is the entire finch genome here. And so you're ordering up along chromosomes here. And this is showing in position along the chromosome particular genes that are having large effects on beak size. So the points going up above the 0 line, those are genes that are specifically linked to beak size. And there's one huge effect gene, and that's HMGA2. So we can also look at evolutionary changes, not just in the average beak size, by looking at averages and how they change through time, but also in the particular genetic variants at the genes that are determining that beak size. Okay, so the third thing I want to do now, so I've told a story about how these finches are evolving rapidly when the environments change. And then I've said that in certain situations, if you have two different resources, natural selection will act such that it will cause one species to split apart and become two, which is how ultimately you got all 14 species in Galapagos. What we've noticed, though, is that if you link these two ideas, environmental change, with the importance of environmental differences in driving an adaptive radiation, that when humans have modified environments dramatically, it's changing all of this. So rapid evolution shaped by humans is modifying everything. So I'm going to play this quick video because it introduces that idea. And this was produced by a UK company, and it will have someone who you've probably heard speaking before. And so it's kind of fun to hear him talk about my research. So this is a very short video. Let's look at it, and then I'll explain what's going on. I'm realizing now you might not have video or sound, but if not, we'll talk about it after.
Perhaps, the finches that Darwin made famous are still providing new insights. Biologist Andrew Hendry is looking at how the finch's evolution may have been affected by human settlements.
When humans come into a new location, essentially what they do is they change the environment, and that's changing selection that's acting on the population.
I hope you guys could hear that. Can someone let me know if you could hear it?
No, we could not, except for the first part. We heard the voice that you wanted us to hear.
Okay. Right. Probably I spoke up and then it cut out. But anyway, the basic gist of it is that is a story about how humans have come to Galapagos. Well, also it was nice, the video, because it showed you how we measure the birds and how we catch them and stuff. But the key message there is that humans have changed what the finches are eating. So in places where you have a lot of people, the finches are feeding on potato chips and rice and bread and things like that. And when finches are doing that, it doesn't matter what your beak size is anymore. So as a result, you basically erase this process where specializing on different food types is causing the finches to split apart, because now they're all eating the same thing. It doesn't matter what beak size you have if you're eating rice or potato chips. So this is what how we're showing that occurred here. So if you go to the town back in the 1960s, so this is the year I was born, and it's kind of cool because someone was collecting data for me in the year I was born. And if you look at this distribution within the medium ground finch, you see what I showed you before. That is, the small beaked birds, then it seems to decline. And then you have this bump up of large beaked birds again. So at that site where the town is now, you saw this splitting. And on the bottom, you see the population I just talked about, which is removed from human settlements. And you see the same thing there. There's a small beaked morph and a large beaked morph. Selection's pushing them apart. But if you go to the town now, Academy Bay, you see that the finches are feeding on all kinds of random things. This is actually in the airport, and the finches are just basically coming in and munching away on human foods. So I think the microphone is still on, Gita. You might want to turn it off. Your microphone. Okay. So anyway, so this is when the humans aren't present, and now in the present day, however, you see that now you just have a single distribution of beak size. So by providing all of this food to the finches, where it doesn't matter what your beak sizes are anymore, you basically started to reverse or undo the process by which natural selection has promoted the diversification of different species. And here's a paper we did relatively recently that's showing that that's because they're feeding on different things. So again, this is kind of diet space. These are different types of foods. And the green is natural foods, and the red is human foods. And so finches are eating all of these different things, but at particular locations in town, they're eating way more of the human foods. And they prefer the human foods. So this is in the same thing as Academy Bay I just showed you. It's the main town. And the finches there, if you give them a selection, like a cafeteria style experiment, you give them different food types to choose, they will invariably choose the chips, the cookies, and the rice over the natural foods. So basically, like humans, they prefer junk food as well. And that is sort of changing the way they're evolving. Okay, so I got one final thing to tell you, and that's about the rest of not the rest, but one other major component of the community. So as a reminder, I talked about how work on one place in one species showed rapid evolution. Then I talked about how that process can be generalized to consider how you go from one species into two. And in that case, selection isn't pushing in one direction. Instead, it's pushing in two directions, splitting things apart. And then I just said that if you change the environment such that they don't feed on different things, then they kind of merge back together again. Now, the final thing that I wanted to mention is that the finches themselves are consuming lots of natural foods when they're not around humans. And when that occurs, that means that they are predators on the seeds of plants. And so plants are going out of their way to evolve as well in response to the finches. So it's not just the finches radiating in response to variation in plants, but as they radiate, that changes how they're interacting with the plants because it changes how good they are at eating the seeds of those plants. And so the plants should go out of their way to avoid this predation. I should note that the finches are not good seed dispersers, they're seed predators. So they actually crack the seeds. So they don't do a good job of dispersing them, they're just predators. So I just want to show you that we're doing a bunch of work trying to understand how the plants are evolving in response. This is a particular kind of plant called tribulus, which has a hard, woody fruit, as you call it, as it is called, that contains multiple seeds within it. And so the finches grab these woody things and sort of break into them to remove the seeds. And so here is a pile of these tribulus merocarps. They're called merocarps, these things, where you can see that the finches have removed the seeds from them. Now, interestingly, this species is the one, this tribulus, and the birds feeding on it is what's thought to have driven the rapid evolution of finches on that small island, Daphne Major. So we're now asking, as the finches evolve, do they then cause the evolution of better defenses in this tribulus? So let's watch a finch eating one of these tribulus merocarps. So it picks it up off the ground, adjusts it very carefully. This is quarter speed, by the way, and then slices into it. Makes a hole so it can get the seed, grabs the seed out. That's a lot of work for a little tiny seed. Picks it up again, manipulates it, wants to get another seed, has trouble doing it, it's not really working, repositions it. You see the beak moving back and forth. This is not an easy thing. It takes a lot of effort. Then it finally gets into it and, dropped the seed. So the point here is that this is a difficult interaction for the finch, and the plant can evolve in ways that potentially make it harder for the finch to remove its seeds. So we decided to do an experiment to test this. So we basically took we took 640 of these individual seeds. And just like you can mark a finch, you can mark these merocarps by putting little dye marks on them. Measured them all and then released them into nature, and then came back later and recaptured them and saw which ones had been opened by the finches and which hadn't. So here's just kind of a funny video of the processing period. So we have these plant collaborators. This is Mark Johnson, and my student will pop up in the background here, and going through the process of laying out these merocarps and measuring them, and then getting ready for the experiment. Okay, so this is what it looks like. So you've got these merocarps out in your little experimental arena here. Each one has an individual marking, so you can figure out which ones are going to be eaten by the finches and which aren't. Then you come back later and decide, okay, are the finches eating the bigger ones or the smaller ones? So that's what these data will show here. And the blue is the size of these merocarps that protecting the seeds that were not eaten by the finches versus the ones that were eaten by the finches. And what you can see is that the finches are eating the smaller ones, which is what you expect, right? Because the larger beaked birds are the ones that can get into these things because they're hard to get into. And so as a result, the bigger they are and the harder they are, the harder it is for finches to get into them. So the idea should be that as you have variation across the islands in the size of the beaks of the birds, that should lead to the evolution of the defenses, that is the size and the spines that are found on these merocarps. So we went to a bunch of different locations, picked the seeds up off the ground to see which ones were not eaten by the finches versus which ones were eaten by the finches, determined their sizes, and asked, do you see an association between the size of these merocarps and the size of the beaks of the finches that are foraging on them? So there's variation among different locations in how many of these things are being eaten by the finches. As you might expect, the drier locations are the ones where you're having a lot of these being preyed on, because under wet conditions, the finches just eat the soft stuff. And the interesting thing about selection on them, so now I'm going to be plotting lines for every single location with the average size of the uneaten merocarps versus those that have been eaten by the finches. So what does that look like? A bunch of different islands, a bunch of different locations on islands, and it looks like a big mess. So in some places, the finches are eating ones with longer spines or larger sizes. In other places, it's the opposite. But this is great, because what this means is that selection differs. Selection acting on the size of these things differs among places in Galapagos, which means that we have the power to understand why selection is a certain way in one place and a different way in another place. And if you do that, we found something that was really surprising at first, but became obvious when we thought about it a bit more. So this is the relationship between the survival of these merocarps, these seeds, in relation to the size of the spines of these merocarps here, so these things here, depending on the finch community that was present. And what's interesting is that when you do not have the big finches present, then you have stronger selection on the seeds. Okay, so in a finch community where the big beaked birds aren't present, then you have really strong selection for these merocarps to get large. And it makes sense in retrospect, because if the big finches are present, they can eat everything. So there's no way for the plants to evolve a defense against a really big beaked finch. But if that big beaked finch is absent, then it pays the plants to evolve to be larger, because then the finches can't eat them. So the main point here is simply that there's this interplay between the plants and the finches where each is evolving in response to the others. And as a result, that's driving the diversification of the community of finches and also the community of plants. We've done a lot more work on this. This is just a quick summary. So that's what I talked about, basically trying to merge sort of the classic work being done on rapid evolution with our attempt to understand how that occurs, not just within one species, but splitting species apart, how humans are modifying that process, and how the plants are a key player in this. They're not a passive thing. They're not just sitting there being eaten by the finches. They're evolving defenses in response to the types of finch beaks that are present. And so that was the story I wanted to tell you. Here's a shot going into our field sampling site in Galapagos, where we've set up a tarp to protect us from the sunlight, collecting finches in mist nets, bringing them back to the tarp, measuring them, putting markers on their legs, taking blood for genomic analysis, and seed samples to try and understand how everything is interacting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, that is fantastic talk. It's extremely interesting to learn about evolution in time scales, which are not many centuries or even this thing, but in decades or even few years. That's very interesting. Now the thing is open for questions. Would you be interested in answering, sir? Is it okay?
Sorry, say that again. Questions are good. Yeah.
Okay, good. Now from the audience here. You want to ask? No, go ahead.
Hello, nice talk. Just when you take the blood, is it also possible to sample the saliva and look at the microbiome variation in the finches?
Yeah, so great question. Some folks, some of our collaborators have done that, as a matter of fact. And they looked at the microbiome, and they also looked at the proteins in the saliva. Now, interestingly, there's not a lot of variation among the species in the microbiome, because it varies a lot seasonally as well. That is, in the wet season, everybody kind of shifts their mouth microbiota, and then it goes the other direction in another season. Same thing with the gut. But there's one species that shows a big difference in proteins in the saliva, in the genes associated with that, and in the microbiome. And that species is the one that actually feeds on blood. So on Wolf Island, which is above the main ones that I showed you, there's a population of what they call vampire finches, and they specialize on feeding on the blood of the birds, the seabirds, and also of the iguanas. And they have a very different mouth microbiome and a very different set of saliva proteins, which makes a lot of sense. So yes, there's one part of the radiation that shows a big difference in microbiota, as well as other components of the diet. It's because they specialize on blood.
Okay.
Incidentally, it's kind of fun because there's a book by Kurt Vonnegut called Galapagos, which is a story about, basically it's an evolutionary story about humans that got stranded after a nuclear event on Wolf Island in Galapagos. And the reason they know they're there is because they see the vampire finch. It's an interesting story.
Okay. Next question.
I have two questions. First is, the time scales you are telling about evolution, as Govindarajan mentioned, is astonishingly small. But so far as I am aware, for example, in mammals, it is totally different. Time scales involved are why? The second is, how did these life forms get there? I know that the snakes you find, let us say, in the Manaus forest is very similar to what you find in the South Asian continent. How come they are so separated?
Okay, let me see. I'll try to answer those questions. but you can tell me if you want me to say more. How did they get to the Galapagos? I think was one of your questions, right? That's one starting point. So it depends on the species, obviously. The idea for the birds is that there might have been like a big windstorm that basically pushed the ancestral finch that's on Central and South America over to Galapagos. So phylogenetic analysis has revealed the particular species that's thought to be the ancestor of the Galapagos finches. And it's just a single species on the mainland with sort of a generalist beak. So they've thought to be blown over there. We did a bunch of work on the plants, which are thought to float across, or if they have very small seeds, to blow over. And basically, with the plants, we showed that there's actually quite a bit of opportunity for plants to get over there because all the ocean currents go that way and all the wind currents go that way. And so what's really limiting plants getting in the Galapagos is that the Galapagos environment is very hot and dry, which is really different from the mainland. And so the main filter on getting things to Galapagos is that they're just not well suited for the dry conditions in Galapagos. Your first question was what again? Sorry?
The time scales. We don't understand it. I mean, it is very different in mammals, for example. Okay. We look the same as the people who lived several thousand years ago. How? Why?
Yeah, okay. Well, so with Galapagos specifically, a couple things. One is that the Galapagos Islands have been around for maybe 3 million years or so, but there are some seamounts that are closer to shore that were probably above the surface previously. So the actual age of the current Galapagos Islands is maybe 3 million years or something. But it's possible that there were islands there before that were maybe 7 million or something years ago. Now, the finches are thought to have been there for about 1.5 million years, give or take. Now, if you're thinking about timescales in terms of how much evolution can take place, people have long thought that, evolution, we know that evolution can do a lot if you give it a lot of time. But the surprising thing is it can do a lot even in a shorter period of time. So the evolution that we observe and that others observe in the Galapagos is like decades. And if you have something that lives just a short period of time, then a ton of evolution can occur in a year for microbes or even for insects and things like that. But yeah, if you give it more time, more can occur. So mammoths, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of cool examples of the rapid evolution of large elephant-like things when they get stranded on islands. So in the Mediterranean, there's a bunch of small islands, and when the sea levels changed, you basically got elephants that were stranded on these little tiny islands, and they just evolved small size really quickly. Like 1,000 years, they changed by like 10 times in mass. So I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but hopefully those.
But 1,000 years is still orders of magnitude larger than 2 years you were mentioning for finches. So it's not very clear to me.
Well, I mean, it's hard to know. Like, so take the finches, for example. We know they evolve over 2 years because it's a single really intense episode of selection. But how long did it take the 14 species to evolve their differences? It's hard to know, right? Because we can't go back in time. We just know that if the evolution that we observed was just extrapolated, all that diversification could occur in 1,000 years, maybe less, the entire radiation. But that doesn't mean it did occur that quickly. It's hard to know.
Okay, next question.
What's the lifespan of a finch?
Yeah, great question. So, the average lifespan of a finch is less than a year, right? Because, most of them die as kids. And particularly that's true in drought years. So it's the young ones that are dying, basically. They fledge, they leave the nest, and then they die really quickly because there's not enough food. Maximum lifespan is probably what you're more interested in, right? And that's getting up around 15, 16 years for a finch. That's the maximum. Yeah, they're pretty long-lived birds. We have birds in our data set. So in our data set, the longest confirmed bird that we have in our data set is almost 10 years old.
Okay.
But there's surely older ones as well.
Okay. We have some questions from YouTube, right? Zoom, are there any questions? No. Okay, go ahead. There are some questions from the YouTube, which we have displayed it on YouTube.
So there's one question from YouTube from Krishnan Venkatraman. With the food type changing on account of human intervention, how does it affect the choice of mate? So do the big beaks still mate with the big beaks and small beaks mate with the small beaks? So is this junk food, when this human junk food is available, does that change the mating characteristic of these finch populations?
Great question. And we don't know. We don't know. Because so determining who's mating with who is actually considerably more effort, because you have to go and find the nests, you have to confirm both parents, then you have to capture both parents, and then you have to, take blood samples and all of that. And it's much harder to do that in town because the finches are nesting in people's yards. And so it's a lot harder to do. So we haven't actually tested that. What we do know is that mating patterns in finches are primarily determined by beak size, mainly because it really determines how their mating calls work. And so a small beaked finch that makes a much more rapid call, like whereas a large beaked bird is like so the females key in on that difference. And so that's a functional thing. The big beaked bird simply can't do a short rapid call. So I think mating patterns will just be a function of beak sizes. So what's happening, I think, with humans is that you still have some mistakes between the large and the small birds. You still have some mistakes. And in natural environments, those mistakes die. But under normal conditions, they don't. So I think the primary thing is that the disruptive selection that was pushing them apart disappears. And so you just build up these intermediate birds, and presumably, even if you're still mating mostly with your own beak type, you'll still have it do this. But we have not tested if the junk food is changing the mating habits.
Okay, thank you. Last question, and
yeah.
Okay.
Now I have one question on the flints. Do you find any other flints in any part of the land which belongs to the same genus?
Sorry, say that again.
Now, do you have any other flinches, flinches in mainland or any other part of the world which belongs to the same genus as in Galapagos?
For the finches?
Yeah.
No, there's nothing that's the same genus. So on the Galapagos, there's maybe, I think 4 or 5 genuses just within the ground finch radiation. So the taxonomists have been splitters when it comes to Darwin's finches. And so there's not the same genus off the Galapagos, but the same group has colonized the Cocos Island, which is just a much simpler island radiation off the coast of Mexico. and there, or Central America, and there they have not diversified. So people use the contrast between those islands and the Galapagos to argue that you need all of these multiple different islands to really generate irradiation. But Cocos Island's also a lot closer to the mainland, and so presumably also has a lot more migration between the locations, which may also be why there's only one species of Darwin's finch on Cocos Island, but there's 14 on Galapagos. So that's the most direct contrast, is that if you don't have a lot of little tiny islands like in Galapagos, you don't get irradiation of the same group, not the same genus, but the same group.
Okay, thank you very much. So that ends our today's program. Mr. Vijayan will propose the word of thanks.
I can use the same thing. Thank you, Professor Andrew. It's actually very early morning for you. I would like to thank you. I was communicating with you a couple of times to make sure that this event is happening. And thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. It was, people really enjoyed it. And I would like to thank Dr. Geeta. She is the one who initiated this the event, and she readily come forward to connect us with Dr. Andrew. Thank you very much, Dr. Geeta. And the third one, I would like to thank the IMSC team. Now, a couple of months back, we tried with the hybrid thing in Anna Centenary Library, particularly on the Nobel lecture of this Svante Babu's work. Dr. Tangaraj from Hyderabad was speaking. It was not that much great as like this, because we lack of the technological infrastructure, but still we could go ahead with the lecture. But this time it is a great lecture because we have an excellent technology infrastructure. It has happened because of the IMSC team, and they have dedicatedly come here and bring a lot of equipments and connect us together, and it has went well without any technical hitch. My thanks go to all the team, particularly Varuni, Gayatri, and Indra. Thank you very much, Ara. And my thanks go to Dr. TRG. He's always our pattern. So he started the lecture and he did the event, and he always triggering us to have such lectures. My thanks go to Dr. TRG. Apart from this, I would like to thank all the audience for presenting here and being patient to listen to the lecture and make it a success. Thank you very much, and thank you all.
Hopefully I can come in person someday.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Very happy.
Okay, bye.
Bye.